Hey everyone, I'm Kim, the mom boss behind EmeryandK. Welcome back to my channel. Today's Tumbler tutorial is inspired by a night sky picture that I saw on my Facebook feed. Immediately when my friend posted it, I knew I needed to put that on a tumbler. I promise this is super simple. If I can do it, so can you. Let's get to it. So we're going to go ahead and grab our prepped cup. Today I am using a 22-ounce fatty from the Stainless Depot. And we're going to start with some spray paint. So these are all from Color Shot. The first one is sugar coated. That's just their white. These paints, I've said it before, I love them. Just make sure you shake them for a good minute before you use them. That's very important to the coverage and the spray of these paints. So the first thing we're going to do is just do almost a blueprint of our colors. So I started with that white, that sugar coated. Now I'm going to go in with some of this mermaid. Now the picture that I used for inspiration had like this kind of beam of white in the sky. It had turquoise, teals, and then it went into like a dark navy and a black. It was beautiful. And so I am trying to kind of recreate those colors on this tumbler. The next color I want to use is Stamped Passport. And again, I'm just going in with super light coverage. You want to start just slow and steady. Don't rush it. I feel like with tumblers, sometimes it's easy to go faster than what you need to because you're so excited to get it done. At least that's how I feel. But I'm going to control my excitement. We're going to use Black Tie Affair on the very back because it's going to fade from that white to the teal to the dark blue to the black. But we're just going in slow, so I don't need solid coverage right now. Just map out your colors, make sure that you can fit everything onto your tumbler. So I just gave that a minute or two to dry. These Color Shot paints dry so quickly. So now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to go a little bit heavier with my colors. I want to get that saturated coverage this time. So I'm going back in with the white, and my can right now is about 12 to 14 inches away. And so now I'm going to go in. I was just showing you guys pushing on the very back of the nozzle. So you just get a light spray because I want that white to kind of fade out, but not too much, if that makes sense. You can kind of see, like I want it to fade out a little bit, but not a ton into the other colors. So now I'm going to take that teal, that mermaid, and I'm going to go from the top because I want a little bit of it to fade into the top of that white. I hope that this is making sense. You guys can kind of see how I'm going here. Now, I covered up a little bit more of that white than I wanted to, but don't worry, we're going to go back in one last time. That'll be the last color I spray is the white because it's the lightest. So now you can see here, I'm not going to worry too much about the bottom either. There we go, going back in with the white. The bottom we're going to end up painting over for our nativity silhouette, so don't worry too much about that. Now I'm going to go back in with that Stamped Passport, that really beautiful dark blue. And now here I'm just pushing on the very back of the nozzle super, super lightly. And it's kind of giving me those like little blotchy spots. So this takes a little bit of practice, this part here, just to kind of figure out how much pressure you need on your can. So I would recommend you can see I practice on the door behind where I'm painting. But I would recommend practicing on a little piece of cardboard or something just to figure out your paint. So I went back in with that black, got that coverage super solid. I went in with a little bit more of that blue. This is where we're just going to kind of go back in, make sure we like our paint and the layout of it. You can see I'm finishing off with that white. A little bit more of that teal. This really just go slow and steady until you get it to how you love it, and then you move on to the next step. But for me, a hard thing with spray painting is going too far. So I'm just going in with a little bit more of that dark blue. But sometimes I go too far. I like it and I'm like, oh, I think I can make that a little bit better, and then I mess it up. So once you get it to where you like it, put it down and walk away. I'm going to finish with this white. And if it's not exactly perfect, don't worry, we're going to go in now with some alcohol ink. So the spray paint was just a base for our cup. Now we're going to build even more texture and more color layers using alcohol ink. So I just have this old plate, some gloves, Pinata White, that is my favorite white alcohol ink to use. Then I'm going to have some kind of like rusty color. This is Terracotta and Sahara. And then I have a couple different blues. We have, I think Azure is how you say it. Azure blue, Aqua blue, Caribbean, And then the last one is Arctic. And I prefer to apply my alcohol inks for this tumbler with just a few pieces of the magic eraser. I like magic eraser because it doesn't absorb a bunch of your alcohol ink. A lot of it ends up back on your cup. You don't waste a bunch of it. So we're going to start first with the white, and I'm just kind of going up that strip of white. So my inspiration picture that I showed you guys, it has this like just stark beam of white. It's so cool. And so I'm just going over that white paint with this white alcohol ink because it's going to give it a little bit of texture, but it's also just going to amplify the whiteness of the white. And so now we're going to go in with our aqua blue. We're going to save the azure blue for a little bit later because that one is the darkest. So this aqua blue, I'm going to grab a new little magic eraser. I'm just going to kind of start working that in the edges of that white alcohol ink. This one I had to pause and like repop the top of it because it got clogged or something. But we're just going to kind of work it in. And again, just like with the paint, start out slow. Like there's no rush. Don't try to get this done in one quick swoop. We're building colors, we're building textures. So just take your time. So I'm going to kind of go in, I'm going to lay out again my blueprint with my alcohol inks kind of where I want that color. And I love how this is turning out because obviously where there's kind of white alcohol ink or white spray paint below it, it's a little bit lighter. And then you can see kind of on that left side where it's more in that kind of teal spray paint, it's more intensely blue. So I just love that. And so now I'm going to use the next blue. This is the darkest one. So this is that azure blue. And I'm going to mix it with a little bit of my aqua blue, and I'm just going to start going in on, kind of the outside of that initial blue layer. So I feel like there's not really a ton of talking I need to do here. You guys can really just see how I'm kind of layering my colors together. I had to repoke that one again too. These alcohol inks don't like me tonight. But I'm literally just kind of mixing colors, going in freely. As long as you start light and then build on your coverage, you really can't mess this up. So I'm just going to put on a little bit of music, let this kind of speed through so that you guys can see exactly what I'm doing, because again, I feel like I'm just going to end up rambling on when you could just kind of relax your brain and not listen to my voice, listen to a little bit of music, and just watch what I'm doing visually, kind of learn it. Alright, so once you finish with your alcohol ink, you're going to give it like 10-15 minutes and you can go straight in with epoxy. I never seal my alcohol ink. I never have an issue with it. If you normally seal it, you can of course go for that. But you guys know in Kim fashion, we are going to mix some mica powder into our epoxy because I want that sparkle. So we're going to be using Blueberry Ice, which has this gorgeous blue sparkle, and then Ultra White, which is just... it is ridiculous how much this sparkles. So we're going to put just a little bit of each, like a sprinkle, you can see I'm showing you guys here, into our epoxy. For this 22 ounce fatty, I've told you guys before, I never measure my epoxy, so I'm sorry, I don't know how much to tell you to use. But I would say it's a couple tablespoons of epoxy. Ish. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. But when in doubt, always mix up a little bit extra because you can always pour it into a mold or, you know, whatever. But we're going to put a little sprinkle of each of those into our epoxy. We're going to mix it really well, and we're going to apply it to our cup. Now, because I am going to be putting a stencil on this with vinyl and removing it, I'm going to do this coat of epoxy. It's going to cure, and I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to let it cure for a full 12 hours before I think about putting my stencil on my tumbler. Look at that sparkle. It is ridiculous. Ridiculous. So once your second layer is cured, we'll move on to our decal. I will put the measurements of what I cut my decal in the description box. It might be a little bit different because we have epoxy on our cup. Yours might be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller than mine, but I will include the measurements. So this is just a nativity scene that I found in Cricut Design Space. There's a bunch of them on there. There's a ton on Etsy if you want to look on there as well. So I measured it, I cut it. This is just a color vinyl that I don't typically use a lot of. And now I'm going to reverse weed it. So what we would normally leave on for our decal, we're going to take off. Now just go nice and slow. There are, I'm assuming yours will be the same kind of little pieces in between the animal's legs and stuff. And if you're like me, you are a total slacker, your Cricut needs a new blade, but you don't have any and you always forget to buy one at Walmart when you go. So just go slow, make sure you don't get any of those little pieces coming up that you don't want when you're weeding this. Once you've finished weeding your stencil, you're going to go ahead and grab some painter's tape, a piece of transfer tape large enough for your decal, and your little vinyl squeegee. So I'm just going to peel the end off here. The biggest part about putting your transfer tape on this decal is just trying to get it on nice and flat. If you get some little bubbles in it, not the end of the world. It just is a lot easier to put on your cup if the transfer tape is on there wrinkle free. So I like to just put a little bit down on the edge. You saw like half an inch or so, and then I just take my vinyl tool and literally it just squishes right on to my decal. So super simple. Make sure you push that down really well so that you get all those little tiny pieces, all those ones that tried to come up when you were weeding. Make sure you just push down on both sides because it is a pain to put a stencil on a tumbler if it's not stuck well to your transfer tape. So I'm going to trim that little excess on the bottom there because we don't need it and it's just going to get in the way. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my cup. And now I wanted little baby Jesus here in the stable to be lined up with that white stripe in the sky because we're going to put the star in the sky after. And I just think that's like the focal point on my tumbler. And obviously baby Jesus is the focal point of the nativity. So I'm going to use a piece of painter's tape just to hold that down. Probably not necessary with the transfer tape, but I wanted to be safe, not sorry. So you can see here, I'm just pointing out that my decal is going to overlap itself a little bit, but no worries, we're going to trim that. So to start wrapping my decal on my tumbler, I'm going to pull off like half an inch to an inch or so and trim it and expose that sticky vinyl. I'm just going to lay it right down on my cup. And again, I'm going to use that handy vinyl squeegee. I'm going to remove my painter's tape. I'm just going to pull up my backing here and carefully lay that onto my tumbler. You want to go slow, again, just to make sure you're getting all those little tiny pieces. Don't rush this part because if you end up tearing your decal, you have to start all over again, and that's kind of a pain. So just go nice and slowly. I am just peeling back a teeny bit of the backing at a time, pushing it on with my vinyl squeegee, and just repeating the process until the whole stencil is on my cup. If you end up getting some little wrinkles in your stencil, don't fret too much about it. Again, this is just a stencil, so if it doesn't go on 100% perfect, you're the only one who's going to know, because it's going to come off and all it's going to be left is the paint. If you get any like little bubbles or anything like that, don't worry about it. If you think it's affecting how your image looks, just take a little X-Acto knife. You can always trim any little wrinkles and flatten them out. I did actually have a part, so the cow on this template had udders, which I was like, oh, that's cute, like nice detail. But after I spray painted it, it looked very not in place. So I'll show you guys how you can remove some spray paint if you need to, if you have like a weird udder situation like my cow did, or if you just have kind of a place where it's seeped under your decal. So we've made it to the edge. I'm just going to put the backing underneath that side of my decal. I'm sorry I'm a little bit out of frame, but I'm literally just taking my X-Acto knife and I'm just going to trim the excess off of one side of the decal, either the part that's already on your tumbler or the part that's up. The part that's on my tumbler had enough space for me to trim it, and so that's what I went with. Again, I'm sorry I'm out of scene here. So I'm just going to remove the transfer tape, and then I'm going to remove that vinyl, and then I'll be able to lay the rest of my stencil down, and you won't even know that there was a little bit of overage for your vinyl. And then on my decal on the bottom, I did have to hand trim just a little bit right here where they meet, just because one is a little bit, one end is a little bit higher than the other, but I'm just going to trim that. You want to make sure you get all your little pieces. Again, those little pieces push down on your tumbler so they don't come up with your transfer tape. So go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to grab my X-Acto knife again, and I will show you how I trimmed the edges, just so that it looks like a seamless a seamless connect on there, just so that you can't tell that it was kind of two different sections wrapped together. So carefully remove that transfer tape. Now this is a reason that I do 2 coats of epoxy on my cup before I do the stencil. It doesn't happen often, but occasionally I will have some epoxy, if it's just one thin coat, peel up with my vinyl stencil when I remove it. So this is why I like to have 2 coats on there. If you are comfortable doing one, you can go ahead and do one. I was going to say that earlier, but I forgot, so I'm saying it now. So I'm just taking my X-Acto, I'm just trimming that. Then you can see there's a little space at the top of this stencil that's open. So I'm going to make sure I cover that up with painter's tape. Just make sure you don't get any of your animals when you do that, because we're going to take this outside and we're going to spray paint it. So I like to err on the side of caution, and I like to cover all of the area I don't want paint on with some tape. So I have this just regular blue painter's tape, and then I'm going to come in with a thicker tape just because I can use less pieces of it. If you don't want to tape your entire tumbler because you're not worried about spray paint overspray, more power to you. I am just not good about putting that worry aside, so I just taped the whole tumbler. Plus it was super windy out today. You guys will see when I paint. It's crazy how windy it is, but I'm just going to cover that little open space, making sure I don't get my animals, and then I'm going to finish wrapping the rest of my cup in tape. All right, let's move on to painting our stencil. So I'm using Smoke and Mirrors from Color Shot. This is a metallic paint, so I shook this can for 2 minutes. I set a timer. I never have issues with Color Shot paint running as long as I shake it for an actual minute, but the metallic ones I find a little bit thinner and a little bit more likely to run. So I always like to shake it extra good. It was also super windy this day. It was insane. Like my whole arm, like all the tape at the top of my cup was covered in paint. So I ended up doing 2 coats. I did that first light coat and let it dry for about 5 minutes, and then went in with another light coat and I had solid coverage. If it hadn't been super windy, I could have gotten away with just doing 1 coat, but because like 3/4 of the paint just blew off the cup, I had to do 2. I'm going to give my paint about 15 to 20 minutes to dry. If you're not using Color Shot paint and you're using like Rust-Oleum, I would recommend waiting like a half an hour to 45 minutes. Don't get super excited and try to peel off your stencil before your paint is dry, because you'll ruin it and you'll have to do all that work over again. So I'm going to go with my weeding tool and I'm going to carefully remove all the pieces of my stencil. Now my biggest kind of, I don't know if it's a secret or like tip for this, is when you're removing those little pieces, sorry my head is in the way, but it is so hard to look at those little pieces with a camera above your head and not get your face super close to your cup. So I'm sorry about that. But my biggest tip for removing these little pieces in your stencils is always pushing your weeding tool into the vinyl. So if it slips, it's going on the vinyl, it's not going onto your paint and you're not scratching it, because there's nothing worse than doing a peekaboo and having to fix scratch paint. That's just a pain. So just take your time, make sure that you're getting all those little tiny pieces. I have done peekaboos in the past, one time where I didn't remove all of the vinyl and I epoxied over it and I had to start my cup over. There's a little sanded spot on my cup too because it was a fuzz, so just ignore that. So here we go, as I promised earlier, with this utter situation on my cow. So I'm just taking a Q-tip and some rubbing alcohol, and I kind of squish the end of the Q-tip and I just rub it gently on the paint. Just go slowly. Don't go in too quickly, or you could end up removing more than you want to. You could also do this with acetone, but I prefer not to, because acetone takes off the paint just so much more abrasively. I'm always worried I'm going to take off too much and mess it up. So I'd rather go a little bit slower and end up with something that I like than try and go a little bit faster and end up messing it up. Next, we're going to move on to our decals, and I have sped this up because this tutorial was already super long, and I am not the biggest fan of watching people do decals on tutorials, so I'm just going to speed this up because it's pretty straightforward. So we're going to start with our star, and I just put that right above little baby Jesus in the staple. Now I'm going to use a piece of transfer tape on the opposite side of my cup to mark the middle of my star so that I can get my decal on the opposite side of my cup positioned right, so that it has even space between each side. Hopefully I'm articulating that correctly. So this is another one I found on Cricut Design Space. It says Silent Night, Holy Night, all is calm, all is bright. It had these little stars. I did not like them. So the first thing I did was put on the background. I did a 0.03 offset. You guys know I love to offset my decals. So I put that on, measured to make sure it's straight, and now I'm just taking one word at a time and I'm going to put that on top. So I did the offset the same color silver as my star, and then my main font is just in black. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on there, take out all these little tiny pieces that I didn't get before I transferred my decal, and we will be ready to move on to our last step before we can do epoxy again. We're going to add some little tiny hand-painted stars. And when I say stars, I mean just little dots of white acrylic paint. So I'm going to be using this clay tool, and it has two ends. It has a metal and a silicone end. And I recommend trying it on a piece of paper or a scrap piece of vinyl or whatever before you go onto your tumbler to figure out if you prefer the silicone end or the metal end. I prefer the silicone end because I can make larger stars and smaller stars, whereas with the metal end, it's basically just like the same size all around. So just figure out which one you like better and go for that. If you end up with a star in your cup that you don't like, you can go ahead and wipe it off. If one ends up drying and you're like, oh, I have too many here, too many there, you can just use a damp paper towel or a damp Q-tip, and they will also wipe off as well. My biggest tip here is just to be careful when you're turning your cup that you're not hitting your wet stars with your hand or rubbing them on the table and smearing them. Because if I'm being honest, I had to film this twice because the first time I did this, I smudged all the stars on the front when I turned my cup to do the back. But it happens, right? Mistakes are part of learning. They're part of crafting. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish my little stars. I'm going to get it to where I like it. And then I will do 2 more coats of epoxy on my tumbler and it will be finished. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this tutorial helpful, maybe a little bit inspirational. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up on my video. If you want to see more tutorials in the future, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I do plan to upload a new tutorial, maybe two, every single week. Until next time, happy crafting.